She had not spoken a word in 3 years, and the man who hired her did not learn it until she stepped down from the coach at Ruby Gulch and could not answer when he asked her name. He nearly sent her back. He had 2 children burning with fever in a house above the mine, a wife 18 months in the ground, and no patience left for a servant who could not so much as tell him what to call her. But the agency had sent no one else. The first hard snow was 3 weeks off, and the woman only looked at him with a steadiness that unsettled him, lifted her own bag before he could reach it, and waited to be shown the way. So Callum Reed took the silent maid up the mountain to his dying twins, and told himself it made no difference, for by then he had stopped believing anyone alive could help them. If something in you leaned toward that silent woman, if you have ever carried a grief so heavy it took the very words out of your mouth, then stay with me and subscribe to this channel before we go on. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Because the maid who could not speak had buried 2 of her own under the same fever, in a sealed room exactly like the one those twins were dying in now. And she alone in that house was about to notice the one thing the doctor never had. She had 8 hours until dawn. She would need every one of them. Her name was Grace Holt, and once she had not been silent at all. She had been a midwife's daughter down in the San Luis country, raised with her hands in the work of saving people. And she had married a good man named Daniel and borne a daughter. And for a little while, she had been about as happy as a person is permitted to be. Then a fever came through the valley one autumn and took them both, her husband and her little girl, 3 days apart, in a room a doctor had ordered sealed against the night air and kept hot as an oven. And after she buried them, Grace Holt found that the words had simply stopped. Not from her ears, from her mouth. She could hear every word the world said to her. She could no longer shape a single one of her own. The doctors called it a grief-struck dumbness and said it would pass. 3 years on, it had not. A silent woman, it turned out, could find only one kind of work, the kind that asks nothing of her but her hands. So she went into service and was let go from 3 houses in 2 years, not for any fault in her labor, but because a big, plain, silent woman unsettles people, and they would rather not have the discomfort of her about. The agency in Denver had near given up placing her when the notice came up from Ruby Gulch. A widowed rancher, 2 small children sick, a house wanting a woman, and nobody else willing to go up into fever country before the snow shut the passes. The coach driver who carried her the last grade told her the rest. Talking to fill the silence, she would not. Reed, he said, ran cattle in the high valley and sold beef down to the camp. Lost his wife Maggie to the fever a year and a half back when it first came through. And now the same fever, or its cousin, had hold of his twins, Lily and Tom, 2 years old and not, the driver feared, long for this world. The dead wife's sister kept house up there, a hard and particular woman. And old Doc Greer rode up every day and came down every evening shaking his head. "Truth told, ma'am," the driver said, "I'd not be much surprised to drive you back down empty by week's end, and 2 small coffins riding with you." The Reed place stood high against the timber, and it was a house under siege, not from any enemy a man could shoot, but from the thing that had already beaten it once. Every window was shut and shuttered, though the day was fair. Smoke stood straight up from the chimney in the cold, still air. And from a room above came a sound Grace Holt knew in her marrow, the very sound that had ended her own speaking 3 years before. The thin, worn-out, barely there crying of children grown too sick to cry properly anymore. She did not let her face show what it did to her. She picked up her bag and went in. Adeline met her in the front hall, Maggie's sister, narrow and tired and proper, with a ring of keys at her waist and a glance that priced Grace in a single sweep and found her wanting. "The agency might have warned us you were a mute," she said. "Well, you'll do the rough work and keep clear of the sick room. The doctor allows no one near the children but myself." "Can you understand me at all?" Grace took the slate and chalk from her apron pocket, her one means of speech, and wrote, "I understand everything." Then, after a moment, she added a second line, "I can nurse." Adeline read it, and her mouth went thin. "We have a doctor for that," she said. Callum Reed came through then, and Grace saw at once a man worn clean past the end of himself. Gray-faced, unshaven, with the eyes of someone who has been bracing a long while against a blow he knows he cannot stop. He barely looked at her. "Whatever Adeline says," he told her, and it was less an instruction than an apology. The words of a man who no longer believed the arrangement of his household mattered, because he no longer believed his household would last. He went heavily up the stairs, and a door opened above, and Grace caught, before it swung shut, one glimpse into the sick room. It stopped her where she stood. The room was sealed like a tomb, windows shuttered, every crack stuffed with rag against the night air, a fire roaring in the grate, and a charcoal brazier going besides, the heat of it rolling down the stairwell like a breath from a furnace. Two small shapes lay buried under heaped quilts in that oven of a room, slick and shining with sweat, too spent to fight the coverings off them. And on the table the lamp flame burned, low and strange. Grace Holt had stood in a room exactly like that one, 3 years gone, and watched her own daughter labor for breath in it and done nothing, because the doctor had said the heat would sweat the sickness out. The doctor had been wrong. She had spent 3 years learning how wrong. She did not write a word of that on her slate. No one in that house would have heeded a dumb maid contradicting Doc Greer on her first night under his roof. Instead, she found the kitchen, surrendered to grief like the rest of the place, the stove cold, the dishes standing unwashed, a meal nobody had eaten gone hard on the table. And she set water on to boil, and from the marrow bones in the cold box, she began, quietly, to build a broth. It was the only doctoring they would permit her that night. So she did it well, and she watched, and she waited, and she kept her own counsel, the way the silent learn to do. In her bag, wrapped in a square of flannel, lay a single small knitted shoe that had been her daughter's. She did not take it out, but she knew it was there, the way you always know. What Grace understood, that the doctor and the grieving aunt did not, was that you cannot sweat the life out of a child in the name of saving it. But it was not a thing she could say, and not a thing they would hear if she could. And so for those first days she fought the only way the silent are able to, by being so plainly, quietly right about the small things that the larger thing might, in time, be believed. She made broth. And the smell of it, marrow and onion and a little sage, was the first wholesome smell that house had held in weeks. And it drew Callum Reed down to the kitchen against his own will. He had been living on coffee and dread. She set a bowl in front of him without a word, and he ate it the way a man eats who has forgotten he owns a body. And when he was done, a little of the gray had gone out of his face. He looked at her then, truly looked, for the first time. She did not look away, nor make anything of it. She only ladled him more. It was little Lily who reached her first, as the smaller and sicker of the two will. Adeline, worn to the bone herself, had at last to sleep, and left Grace to sit the room an hour with strict orders to change nothing. Grace changed nothing the doctor would notice. But she dipped a clean cloth in cool broth and touched it to the cracked lips of the burning child. For they had been giving the twins not a drop to drink, the old fever wisdom, holding that water only feeds the fire. And the little girl, half senseless, turned toward the wet like a plant turning to light, and took it, and took more, and for the first time in days left off the awful thin crying and slid into a true and easy sleep. Her brother Tom, when Grace did the same for him, caught her finger in his hot small fist and would not let it go. The silent woman sat between the two sick children in that furnace of a room and let the boy hold on. And something in her own chest that had been 3 years frozen cracked clean through. She made no sound at all. But the tears came down and fell, and for once she let them. Callum found her so near morning when fear would not let him sleep. He saw the children resting easier than they had in a week. He saw the cool cloth, the cup of broth, the small forbidden things she had done. He did not scold her for it. He drew the second chair to the other side of the little bed and sat down. And the two of them kept the watch together in silence, which is its own language, and the one she knew best of all. By the time the window grayed, he had begun, without a single word passing between them, to trust her. And a man worn down to nothing does not let himself trust again, unless some buried part of him has decided, against all its hard-learned sense, that the world might not take everything from him, after all. In the days that followed, he began, in the wordless way of his kind, to look after her in turn. She came down one cold morning to find the kitchen stove already lit and drawing, though she had risen before the sun to light it herself for a year of mornings. She found her cracked boots mended and oiled and set by the door. He said nothing of any of it, and she wrote nothing of it on her slate. And between two people who had each long forgotten how to ask for a single thing, this became, slowly, a kind of conversation. But the children were eased, not saved, and Doc Greer rode up the mountain that afternoon and undid it. He found the windows the maid had cracked an inch and ordered them sealed and stuffed again. He found the cup of water and forbade it outright. The fever was at its crisis, he said. The room must be kept close and hot. The children sweated hard through the coming night, and any fool meddling now would kill them outright. He looked at Grace's slate, where she had written one single word, air, and did not even trouble himself to be angry. He only told Adeline to keep the dumb woman out of the room, banked the brazier high, and rode back down to his supper, certain he had done all that medicine knew how to do. By dark the twins were sinking again, deeper than before, in a room shut tight as a coffin and hot as a forge. And Grace Holt, locked out on the landing with her useless slate, understood that both children would be dead by morning unless she did the one unforgivable thing, and that she was the only soul in that house who knew it. She waited until the house lay dead asleep. Adeline collapsed in her chair. Callum, fallen at last into the first true sleep he'd had in days, stretched on the floor outside the door. Then Grace Holt went into the sealed room alone, by the light of the one low lamp, and made herself look hard at the things she had glimpsed that first night, and been 3 years too afraid to trust. The lamp flame was wrong. It burned low and ringed with blue and would not stand up tall however she trimmed the wick. Her own head had begun to swim and ache the moment she crossed the threshold, the same swimming ache she remembered from another sealed room 3 years before. And the children. She watched them through one slow, terrible minute, breathed worst, lay stillest, sank deepest in the dead-hot heart of that shut-up place. It was not the fever alone that was killing them. It was the room. The roaring fire in the banked brazier had been eating the good air all night and leaving the foul behind, the same charcoal gas that drops men dead in closed mines. and the sealed windows meant to keep the deadly night air out had done nothing all week but hold the deadly air in. The cure was the killer. It had been the killer 3 years ago. She had only not let herself know it in time to save her own. She would not be too late twice. Grace Holt threw open the shutters. She broke the seal on every window and let the bitter, clean mountain night come pouring in. She dragged the brazier out onto the landing and beat its fire down to dead embers. She stripped the sweat-soaked quilts off the 2 small bodies and bathed them in cool water and worked broth and water between their lips, a drop at a time, while the cold air swept the poison from the room. Adeline woke and shrieked that she was murdering the children, that the night air would finish what the fever had begun, and the noise brought Callum up off the floor. And there it all was, in the freezing heart of the night. The aunt screaming to seal the room, the silent maid standing her ground between the open window and the children she would not surrender, and a broken father made to choose, in the dark, between the doctor's certainty and the wordless conviction of a woman who could not even tell him why. Callum Reed looked at the maid. He looked at his children and saw them already, in the cold, clean air, breathing easier than they had in a week. And he made the bravest choice a frightened man can make. He sided with the one who had given him cause to hope over the one who had only ever told him to make ready for the grave. "Leave it open," he said to Adeline. "Let her work." Adeline left the house at first light and did not come back to it. Through the rest of that long night, the silent woman and the worn-down man fought for 2 small lives in a cold and brightening room, bringing the fevers down slow, getting water into them, sip by patient sip. The father holding one twin against his chest while the maid worked over the other. Then the 2 of them trading. And somewhere in the blackest hour, when little Lily's breath went ragged and the child seemed to drift toward leaving, Grace Holt did a thing she had not done in 3 years. She began, very low, to sing. It came cracked and strange from a throat 3 years unused. Scarcely a thread of a lullaby her own mother had once sung, the very one she had sung over her own dying daughter. But it was sound, and it was hers, and the burning child quieted to it and held on. By the time the sun came up red over the timber, both fevers had broken. The twins lay sleeping cool and clean and alive in a room full of morning light and mountain air. She had saved them both by dawn. Word had gone down to Ruby Gulch the evening before that the Reed twins were dying. So by full morning a knot of people had come up the mountain the way folk will, to sit with a man through the worst of it, the preacher, 2 neighbor women, and Doc Greer at the head of them. Come to sign what he was certain would be 2 small death certificates. They found the windows flung wide and the house gone cold and a silent maid carrying a tray of broth. They found Callum Reed on the porch in the red sunrise, wearing the face of a man brought back from the dead. And behind him, through the open door, 2 children sitting up in a clean, bright bed, fever thin and weak and entirely alive, calling for their father. Doc Greer went up and examined them, and could not make it make sense until Grace put her slate into his hand. She had written it out plainly while she waited. The low blue flame, the brazier left burning all night in a sealed room, the headache that took anyone who entered there, the children always worst at the very heart of the heat. Charcoal gas, she had written, the same that kills miners. The room was the sickness. The doctor read it and went the color of ash, for he was not a stupid man, only a proud one, and he knew the instant he read it that it was true, and that his own orders had come within a breath of killing 2 children he had meant to save. He did not say so to the room, but he closed his bag and he said, low and only to her, Where did you learn that?" And Grace Holt opened her mouth, and in a voice rusted and quiet, and 3 years in the coming, she spoke the first words she had said since the day she buried her own. "I learned it too late once," she said. "Not this time." The room went still as held breath. Callum Reed crossed to her and took her hand, in front of the preacher and the neighbor women and the shamed old doctor, and he said the thing he had to say plainly, the way a man does once he has finally come into something worth the saying. "Every house in 3 counties turned this woman off for being silent," he said. "I near sent her back down the mountain myself." And she walked into a room a doctor had given up for a grave. And she saw the one thing not a one of us could see, and she handed me back my children with her own 2 hands. She is worth more than this ranch, and more than anything the lot of us ever reckoned her. And there is not a thing on God's earth she could ask of me that I would not give." Grace wrote nothing at all on her slate. She had no need to. She only held on to his hand and let herself, for the first time in 3 years, be a person who was seen. The snow came 3 weeks later, just as the driver had promised, and shut the High Valley Inn for the winter and inside the Reed house. With windows that opened now, and a chimney a man had swept clean with his own hands, and air that moved through the rooms, 3 grown people and 2 small children set about learning how to be a family in the quiet. Grace did not get all her words back at once. They came slow, the way feeling comes creeping back into a limb gone numb. A few at a time, and only when they mattered most. She spoke the twins' names first, and then their bedtime stories. And then, one evening by the fire, when she believed no one of consequence was listening, she laughed out loud at something the boy Tom had said. And Callum Reed had to leave the room, rather than let her see what the sound of it did to him. In the spring, when the ground at last gave way to the spade, Grace took the small knitted shoe out of its square of flannel, the last thing on earth she owned of the daughter she had not been able to save, and she buried it under a young aspen at the edge of the timber, and she said over it, in her own found voice, the words she had never once been able to say. Then she came back down the hill, to the living. Callum walked out with her, and stood by her, and did not crowd the grief, which was its own kind of love. They married in June, with Lily and Tom underfoot, and the whole of Ruby Gulch come up the mountain to see it, including a humbled old doctor who never again in his life sealed a sick room against the air, having taken the lesson from a maid who could not, on the night she taught it to him, so much as speak. Grace Reed kept a house of open windows for the rest of her days, and a voice she spent carefully, the way a person treasures a thing they once lost and never thought to hold again. Years on, a young mother down in the camp, frantic over a child gone feverish, was told by the older women, "Go up the mountain and fetch Grace Reed. She'll see the one thing nobody else can." And she did, and Grace saved that child too, and a dozen more across the years. The woman the world had thrown away 3 separate times for the crime of her silence. She had been valued at nothing, unmarriageable, unemployable, unspeakable. She turned out to be the most necessary woman on that whole mountain. She had found her voice again, and she stayed.